One of our friends could certainly be our spouse. Many people would say that their spouse is their best friend. So when we look at marriage in midlife and into later adulthood or elderhood, we see that quite a few people have been married at least once in their life. By the age of 45, 80% of adults have been married. This is, I believe, US Census data. And then that number jumps to about 90% by the age of 60. Now, that doesn't mean that they were currently married during the time that that was assessed. This question is asking just over your lifespan, have you been married? And as a whole, marriage does bring positive associations with it. So it's associated both with physical good health and good mental health as well. Not to say every marriage leads in that direction or is associated with positive outcomes, but this is particularly true often for men, that being married is associated with good overall health. When we talk about late adulthood, and this also applies, I guess, to midlife too, we could be talking about someone's first, second, third, or so on marriages. And I think that that's something that's so interesting about development, that our life takes us in interesting directions. And I mean, you don't know what life is going to throw at you. In late adulthood, we tend to see that people who are married say that they have more time to spend with their spouse. And again, this comes with having maybe less responsibilities with work if for people who are retired, and or not having children in the home. So just this ability to have more time with their spouse than earlier points in their life. And when we look at people who are in late adulthood and how they are kind of characterizing their marriage, lots of individual differences, but we tend to see that there's greater satisfaction than at other points in the lifespan. You recall that during adolescence, we talked about that's one of the lowest points on average for people in terms of marital satisfaction and life satisfaction as well, but it starts to increase. Marriages are also characterized by just there's less negativity, so the people within that relationship aren't really focusing as much on the negative aspects, and accordingly, they might not be dwelling on those. They're being passive aggressive, and so they tend to be more positive. Tend to have more positive interactions with one another. I mean, you can imagine that if you're going into your day to day and with more of an optimistic or positive viewpoint, that's going to affect how you interpret events or what your partner says to you and things like that. So just depending on your outlook, that could affect your day to day interactions. And accordingly, they have fewer disagreements. And I think an interesting finding is that they notice more positive attributes in their partner than the negative attributes. So, not to say that that partner has necessarily changed over time. Let's say that they've been married for decades, but they're just tending to notice more of the positive things. Um, in one of the upcoming lectures, we're going to be talking about something called the positivity effect, where essentially there are older adults who broadly are focusing more on the positive things in their life than the negative things in their life. So it comes as no surprise that this also is applied to one's romantic partner. With some marriages, we know that they end in divorce. And looking at this first statistic, by the age of 45, about a third of men and women roughly have experienced at least one divorce. That's quite substantial, about, a big percentage. Um, but obviously, there are lots of reasons why somebody might want to get a divorce or be asked to get a divorce. Research shows that women are more likely to initiate divorce. This is not just in midlife, this is at other ages as well. And then when we look at, the associations of divorce and outcomes on men and women, there are some gender differences. We've kind of already talked about this a little bit when we talked about relationships in early adulthood. But one of the findings is that tends to be more harmful to women's health. Part of that is because of changes in income, and if women are making less money, that's a societal issue, but also if they're still raising children, then it's balancing that as well. Issues with health insurance, if let's say they lost a spouse's health insurance plan, so it's kind of complicated there. Um, an interesting age difference, though, is that as a whole, middle-aged people are less likely to struggle. So I use problems very broadly here, but I'm just talking about adaptation just broadly, or it could be any kind of physical or mental health, or financial problems too after divorce than younger adults. So it's kind of along the lines as once you get a little bit older, a divorce might affect you less than when you're younger. When we talk about late adulthood, we do see that divorce rates drop quite substantially. Divorce is way less likely after the age of 65. Um, I think that as we go on in time and uh, we might see this change. Essentially, right now, I think about some of the people who are older 65 being more traditional or old school, where divorce isn't something that people do. Obviously, younger people might have different attitudes about divorce than older individuals who might have more of a conservative attitude towards divorce. So it'd be interesting to see what this looks like in another decade or 2 decades to see like how likely is divorce after 65. But that said, part of it is like I mentioned on the last slide, that if we're looking at life in a more positive way, then it might be that divorce rates don't change within the next couple of decades when we're looking at the older population. Because maybe it's the case that, there are many factors at play, and it's not just these traditional views that are keeping people in relationships. I think that understanding marriage and divorce are both complicated, and there are so many different factors at play, but I think really, really interesting to study. Regardless if someone is in a married or committed relationship or not, I wanted to touch briefly on sexuality or sexual relationships in older adults or the elderly. If you are interested in topics like this, I do teach a human sexuality class during J term, but I just find this information really intriguing and also positive. So in the particular study that I'm citing here, it was a national sample. So whenever it's a national sample, those are going to be representative, so people from all walks of life, of 57 to 85-year-olds. So we see late middle age to elderhood. And what they were looking at is just sexual behaviors. And we've already talked a little bit about this when we talked about menopause, but with menopause and also a decline in testosterone levels, we do see declines in sexual activity or sexual interest beginning at around age 50 as a whole for individuals. But that decline doesn't mean suddenly an absence. And in this study, they found that more than half of the oldest people in the study engaged in sexual activity 2 to 3 times a month. And in fact, I believe this was just straight up intercourse, so not even other sexual behaviors. Um, Sexual intercourse, they were asked if they've had that in the last 12 months, and they broke it down by decades of ages. So in their 50s, about 50% of women and 60% of men saying that they have had sex at least once in the last 12 months. In the 170s, though, we still see a sizable percentage of individuals saying that they've had sexual intercourse. So 20% of women, 40% of men. What research tends to show is that for people who are engaging in a lot of sexual behaviors earlier in adulthood, they're more likely to do that also in later adulthood. Not necessarily the same rate, but we call it rank order stability. So for people who are higher than average in their 20s or higher than average in their 30s, then they're also higher than average in their 50s and 60s and 70s, even if it's not to that same extent, like let's say number of times a month or a week or a day. Not just for the elderly, but intercourse is a narrow view. Obviously, sexual behaviors, there's a broad range of different types of sexual behaviors. It could also just be feeling sensual and that close companionship. I mean, even hugging and spooning and things along those lines. Interesting finding is that male partners usually are initiating the sexual activity even in his older age range. This is an interesting and important topic because we often don't want to talk about sexuality in the older populations. For some people, it gives them like the creepies or the heebie-jeebies, but it's a normal part of the lifespan and should be talked about. A lot of elderly individuals might feel uncomfortable talking to their doctors about it, but doctors are also often uncomfortable talking to their patients about these ideas. And problems with that could occur for a number of reasons. But one, we do know that like STDs or STIs are quite common in places like nursing homes, because if the residents aren't thinking that like, oh yeah, they're thinking I can't maybe get pregnant, right, or impregnate someone, but they're not thinking about how likely it is that the STD might be around, and there's nobody to really talk to about those things. There's nobody passing around condoms or other forms of prophylactics. So this is a really important issue to talk about, and it's just something that often gets to it's often considered to be like more taboo or something that that shouldn't be addressed, but it definitely should.